My beloved brothers and sisters, there are moments in life when God pulls back the curtain between earth and eternity, moments when a single encounter can rewrite a destiny. Dr. David Yonggi Cho experienced such a moment when his spirit stepped beyond the boundaries of this world, and he stood face to face with Jesus. What the Lord revealed to him about speaking in tongues did not just open his eyes, it transformed his entire purpose, his ministry, and the lives of millions who heard his message. When Dr. David Yonggi Cho speaks about the moment he died, he doesn't describe it as a story, he describes it as a turning point that shook the very foundation of his soul. He recalls the exact instant his body could no longer hold life. The room around him dimmed, the sounds faded, and he felt himself being lifted out of everything familiar. There was no fear, no panic, only a strange and overwhelming peace wrapping around him like a blanket of light. As he drifted away from his body, he realized he was stepping into a realm that no human eye can see, while living a realm where eternity begins and earthly limitations end. In that sacred moment, Cho understood that death is not darkness, it is separation. It is the spirit leaving what is temporary and entering what is eternal. He describes how time seemed to stop, how every worry, every burden, every unanswered question vanished as he was surrounded by a presence more real than life itself. And then, in that brilliance, he saw him, Jesus. The Lord's presence was not like light, it was light, a living radiance that filled everything around him. Cho felt layers of fear, doubt, and exhaustion melt away instantly as Jesus looked at him with eyes that carried infinite compassion. That encounter shook him because it revealed something he had never understood so deeply before. Spiritual gifts, spiritual power, and spiritual truth become clearer when the noise of the world is silenced. Standing between life and death, Cho realized how easily humans get lost in distractions, how often believers pray with their minds trapped in confusion, anxiety, and human limitation. In that moment, he felt naked before God, seen fully, known fully, and loved fully. This near-death encounter was not just a moment of leaving the world. It was the moment God opened his understanding to something far greater than theology or tradition. It prepared him for the divine message. Jesus was about to give a message that would change everything he believed about speaking in tongues, prayer, and spiritual connection. As Dr. Cho stood in that radiant presence, he felt Jesus draw closer, not with thunder or force, but with a gentle authority that made every part of his spirit attentive. In that holy silence, Jesus spoke to him about something Cho had practiced for years, but never fully understood the true purpose and power behind speaking in tongues. Jesus explained that most believers pray with their minds, and while the mind is useful, it is also limited. The mind becomes tired, confused, distracted, and overwhelmed. But the spirit, Jesus said, never grows weak. It never loses its connection to heaven, and when a believer prays in tongues, it is not the human mind speaking, it is the Holy Spirit flowing through them. Jesus revealed that speaking in tongues is not just a gift, it is a spiritual lifeline. It is heaven communicating through a believer in a language the enemy cannot decode, cannot intercept, and cannot defeat. He showed Cho how many Christians pray with worry, fear, and doubt hidden inside their words, and how their prayers sometimes reflect their emotions rather than God's will. But when a believer prays in tongues, every word comes from the Spirit, pure, accurate, powerful, and aligned with the heart of God. At that moment, Cho understood something he had never seen before. Praying in tongues was not noise, not a ritual, not a practice reserved for a small group of believers. It was spiritual communication that bypassed every human weakness. Jesus allowed him to see how praying in tongues builds a shield around the believer's life, strengthens the inner man, and opens doors that human strength cannot open. Cho felt the truth sink into his spirit. This gift is a weapon, a comfort, a guide, and a direct line into the mysteries of heaven. This revelation did not just enlighten him, it humbled him. He realized how much he had limited his own spiritual growth by relying on his understanding rather than the Spirit's language. Standing before Jesus, he knew this truth would become a message the world needed, a message that would call believers to rise, to pray with spiritual fire, and to use the gift God gave them with boldness and faith. As Dr. Cho listened to Jesus reveal the mystery of praying in tongues, he suddenly began to understand why so many believers live spiritually weak, confused, and drained. Jesus showed him that when a person prays in tongues, something powerful happens inside them. The Spirit begins to bring order to the chaos within. All the scattered thoughts, the hidden fears, the emotional storms that people can't even put into words, the Holy Spirit gathers them, calms them, and translates them into a perfect prayer before God. Cho realized that this divine language brings a clarity that human thinking can never produce. It clears away spiritual fog, silences inner noise, and allows the believer to feel the nearness of God in a way that ordinary prayer often cannot. In that radiant presence, Jesus revealed to him how praying in tongues becomes a source of supernatural strength. Many people pray using their emotions, and emotions become tired. Many pray with their logic, and logic becomes confused. But when a believer prays in tongues, the Spirit inside them is strengthened like fire being fanned into flame. Dr. Cho saw that this strength does not come from effort or discipline, but from surrender, letting the Holy Spirit take over where human weakness begins. Jesus also showed him that tongues opens the door to divine direction. Countless believers cry out for guidance, yet they rely only on their human thoughts. But the Spirit knows where your life is headed, knows what traps lie ahead, knows what blessings are coming, and knows what decisions will shape your destiny. Each time a believer prays in tongues, the Spirit begins to align their path with God's plan, guiding them even when they are not aware of it. Cho understood that this is why people who pray in tongues often find solutions, breakthroughs, and clarity appearing in their lives, not because they figured it out, but because heaven was guiding their steps. This revelation filled Cho with awe. He saw that speaking in tongues isn't meant to be occasional or rare. It is meant to be a lifestyle, a daily flow of spiritual strength, clarity, and direction. It is the quiet power that keeps a believer standing when life tries to shake them, the unseen force that lifts the spirit when the heart is tired, and the way God leads his children when their own wisdom fails. When Dr. Cho returned from that extraordinary encounter, he did not come back as the same man. His spirit carried a weight, a responsibility, a mission that burned inside him with more intensity than anything he had ever felt before. He realized that the message Jesus gave him about speaking in tongues was not meant to stay with him alone. It was meant for the church, for believers everywhere, for every person who had forgotten the true power of the Holy Spirit. As he breathed again, feeling life return to his body, he sensed that God had entrusted him with a revelation that could reshape the spiritual lives of millions. He began to see his ministry through new eyes. What he had once understood as simple preaching or spiritual leadership now felt like a divine assignment. He knew that people were living defeated because they prayed only with their minds. He knew believers were struggling with battles that could be overcome if they allowed the Spirit to intercede through tongues. And he knew that many Christians avoided this gift because of fear, misunderstanding, or lack of teaching. The weight of this realization pressed deeply into his heart. It was as if Jesus himself had placed a torch in his hands and said, "Give this fire to my people." So Cho devoted himself to teaching this forgotten power with a passion he had never carried before. His sermons changed. His prayer meetings changed. His entire spiritual approach changed. He no longer saw tongues as one small part of Christianity. He saw it as a vital key that unlocks a believer's spiritual potential. He taught people that tongues could break chains of fear, strengthen the weak, heal broken emotions, and ignite faith like nothing else. He watched ordinary believers become spiritually bold, confident, and connected to God in ways they had never experienced. Word spread quickly, and people came from all over the world to hear the message. Churches that were once quiet became places of deep spiritual fire. Broken lives began to heal, ministries began to grow. Prayer movements started in homes, in communities, in entire cities. It was as if God took the revelation Cho received in that moment between life and death and multiplied it across nations. People who had felt spiritually empty discovered a new passion. Those who had been stuck in confusion found direction. Families facing spiritual warfare found strength that no human strategy could provide. Cho's mission was no longer just to preach, but to awaken. To remind the world that the Holy Spirit is not a theory, not history, not a symbol, but a living power available to every believer. And the more he taught, the more he saw God transforming lives through the simple, extraordinary act of praying in tongues.